Hi everybody, and welcome to the very first screencast for Edit 6400. We're doing week 2, it's behaviorism, and if you remember last week when we met, last Thursday, we talked about 3 different families of theories that we're going to be looking at. Behaviorism is the very first one, both in our syllabus and historically. And I wanted to give you just a little bit of background on behaviorism, because if you don't stop and think about when it arose and what was going on then, if you're like me, you tend to think, well, how could these people be so limited? How could they take such a narrow view of people? Anyway, you have to put yourself back at the beginning of the 19th century, of the 1900s, the 20th century, 100 years ago. And at that time, my grandmother was born in 1898 and she just died about 10 years ago. And when you consider the things that have happened in her life, the changes that have come, and most of all, the difference that science and technology have made in our lives, it is absolutely amazing. And I know we think about computers, and that certainly has been a huge difference in our lives, especially the information and the communication that allows us, that it puts within our reach. But think earlier. Think the invention of refrigeration so that you could eat fresh foods and foods didn't spoil. Think penicillin. Anytime people rail against technology, I think, yeah, penicillin. People used to die of things that now we're cured of in 24 hours. No problem. Think about automobiles and the distances we can travel now that we never could have before. There was no such thing as a commute before, or at least not a very long one. Think about airplanes, speaking of distances. Think about the original communication devices. Yes, there were telegraphs, but telephones were a huge jump. So back in 100 years ago, which is the time when behaviorism was fermenting and fomenting, basically science was making huge strides. They were looking to science to save the world. And the people who started behaviorism really wanted to put psychology on a scientific footing, because they felt if they could solve the problems of mental illness and criminality and even ignorance and difficulties in school that were so difficult to solve that we're still struggling with today. But they believed that if they could just make psychology scientific, they could get the answers. And to be a science, you have to look at things which are measurable. And that's how behaviorism began. Because you cannot measure what somebody's thinking. It's very difficult to measure even what they're feeling, but you can measure what they do. So the behaviorists basically said, we don't care what you're thinking, we don't care what you're feeling, but we're going to watch what happens when we present a stimulus. What is your behavior? And of course, as I mentioned before, they worked with rats and pigeons a lot, because you can do experiments with rats and pigeons that you can't do with people. So let's look at the first one. Ivan Pavlov was the first of the behaviorists. He was originally a physiologist who did very good work on the process of digestion. In fact, he won a Nobel Prize for it. But nobody much remembers that work anymore. What they do remember is his discovery of classical conditioning. And Pavlov realized, he mostly worked with dogs. He had kennels of dogs, and he was studying salivation. And he realized that to do that, he had to have all the dogs fed at the same time. So he had lab assistants who fed the dogs. And he recognized, a good scientist recognizes things they're not looking for. He recognized that the dogs started to salivate when they saw the lab assistant in the white coat, even if he didn't have food necessarily. So he started to do some experiments, and he discovered that he could pair a sound like a bell or anything like that to the food, and eventually the dog would respond to the bell as the dog would normally respond to the food. And so when you have classical conditioning happening, what you have is an unconditioned or natural response to an unconditioned or natural stimulus. Food is a natural stimulus for dogs. A natural response is to salivate. Originally, of course, dogs do not salivate when they hear a bell, or for that matter, nowadays, a refrigerator door open. But if the food and the bell come at the same time often enough, then the dog begins to respond to the bell as if it were food. And that is the whole trick of classical conditioning. If you want to, take a pause right now and go to the Pavlov's dog game that there's a link to in your module, and you too can teach a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell or a horn or whatever you want. Another thing you can take a look at is Madison Avenue's version of classical conditioning. Madison Avenue is brilliant at classical conditioning. This is what they make their living on. And we've got an advertisement here that you can look at where they are pairing a well-known fast food franchise with all kinds of natural stimuli for young people. The presence of other attractive young people, excitement and adventure, being out in the wilderness. Just take a look and I think you'll see some of the things they're up to. Okay, so we had classical conditioning. The next big step forward, John Watson was big in conditioning, but he basically only built on Pavlov's work, even though he was a major behaviorist. But Skinner, B.F. Skinner, made the next big leap forward. And it came from the fact that he realized that creatures, including people, were not only conditioned by what happened just prior to or with something, but they were also hugely conditioned by the consequences of a behavior. So he developed the ABC model, or operant conditioning. And A stands for antecedent. Your book will talk about cues, and that's an antecedent. B is behavior, and C is consequences. So he put rats and pigeons in Skinner boxes where he taught them to press bars in order to get food. You can see here in the Skinner box, you have an electric grid in the bottom, and you have a food place, and a bar, and a light, and a buzzer. And he taught them very complicated things where they would only press the bar if the light was on, or they would only press the bar if the buzzer rang while the light was on or while the light was off. They could learn all of these things in response to just needing food. And so he came to believe that basically all learning was a process of simply learning how to respond to stimuli based on consequences. And again, if you want to pause, we've got a short video from the TV show Lost where you will see Sawyer in a Skinner box. Now, the kind of consequences that Skinner was talking about, there are basically 4 of them. And basically, any consequence that causes you to wish to repeat the behavior, they wouldn't say wish, behaviorists wouldn't say wish, that causes you to repeat the behavior is a reinforcement. Reinforcements come in 2 types. The classic reinforcement is the reward. You get something. Something happens to you that you like. It causes you to repeat the behavior because it had a good result. Another kind of reinforcement is when the behavior gets you out of something you don't like, and that's called negative reinforcement. Think of negative not as bad, but as like subtracting something. So basically, a classic example of that is your alarm clock. The alarm clock rings, and even in your sleep, you immediately reach over and hit the snooze button. You've been conditioned to do that. Why? Because when you hit the snooze button, that annoying sound stops. That's negative reinforcement. Punishment is anything which tends to discourage or suppress a behavior. Now, in your textbook, these are not called presentation punishment and removal punishment. They are called positive punishment and negative punishment. I personally have never heard those terms used by Skinner. He called them presentation and removal. I wish he'd been a little more consistent. Positive and negative would make more sense here, but anyway, I thought it would be good for you to hear both. A punishment can be either something bad that happens to you, and school detention is really not a very good example because school detention is basically taking away your free time, which is more like a removal punishment, unless like they have whips and chains in the detention room. But a classic kind of a presentation punishment is a spanking for a young child. Something unpleasant occurs when they do a behavior, and the idea is that they will stop doing the behavior to avoid the unpleasantness. A removal punishment is when you lose something you like. Again, it causes you to stop doing that behavior. The classic example is you do something you shouldn't. Your mom or your dad says no TV for a week, no video games for a week, that kind of thing. One of the difficulties people have with operant conditioning is that the subject, the dog or the person that you're trying to condition, has to do the behavior before you can reward it. Well, that's very difficult if the behavior is complicated. For example, in fourth grade, we want children to learn how to do long division, but we can't just sit around and wait for them to do long division and then reward them for it. So the classic behaviorist solution to this is something called shaping, in which you reward successive approximations toward the desired behavior, so that at first only the first step toward the desired behavior has to be taken. For example, if you were teaching long division, maybe you would start by teaching children how to set up the problem, and if they set up the problem correctly on a quiz, they would get a point. Okay. Again, this is a really good time to pause and take a look at the shaping video, very short video, of a border collie, someone teaching a border collie, and there's the border collie. Border collies are probably the smartest dogs in the dog world. Somebody takes about 5, 6, 7 minutes to teach a border collie to jump into a box. And I think you'll enjoy the video. Now, there are some problems with behaviorism. There are ethical issues because with punishments and rewards, you can persuade people to do a lot of things, some of which they probably shouldn't do. And I think the recent debacle on Wall Street is a perfect example. If you offer people enough money, they'll do a lot of things that they shouldn't do. However, there are some other problems with behaviorism too. And one of the problems is that unlike rats and pigeons, people don't like to be manipulated. The desire to be in charge of themselves is very powerful in people. As far as we know, rats and pigeons don't look at the experimenter and go, well, damn it, you're not going to boss me around. But people and cats do so. And here's Pavlov's cat. This is why Pavlov worked with dogs instead of cats. Because people don't like to be manipulated, very often extrinsic punishments and even rewards can backfire on you. Let's take a look at some of the problems with punishment. Punishment actually, if you're working with people or animals, should be your very last resort. Animal trainers hardly ever use punishment. And unfortunately, this is something that our school system hasn't learned yet. But the problems with punishment are manifold. First of all, punishment doesn't teach the child or the animal what you do want them to do. It only teaches you what you don't want them to do. For children, it focuses attention on undesirable behavior. And again, unlike rats and pigeons, for people, attention itself can be a reward. So that, for example, the class clown in a classroom is getting a whole lot of attention. So even though he gets in trouble, even as he is punished by the teacher, he's drawing attention, and that itself can be rewarding. The other problem with punishment is it has a lot of side effects, just like a bad medicine. A particularly common side effect is that when someone is punished, they tend to try to avoid the whole situation. So that, for example, If a child, every time he goes to school, is embarrassed because he doesn't know the answers, or he's teased by other children, or he's yelled at by teachers, guess what? Pretty soon, as soon as he can, he's not going to go to school. He's going to avoid it because he's been classically conditioned to dislike school. Another problem with punishment is that it causes people to cheat, to try to get out of it. This happens especially when people are being punished for a behavior they cannot avoid. The Atlanta Public Schools situation a few years ago is a perfect example of this. Basically, teachers and schools were going to be punished if children did not show certain level of test score achievement that the teachers and schools, rightly or wrongly, believed was impossible. So when faced with a demand for the impossible, what did they do? They cheated. And people do this in college and school all the time. Punishment also creates a hostile oppositional environment between the teacher and the students in a school setting. And that's a bad thing. It's hard to learn from somebody that you have fear or resentment or defiance toward. Punishment also creates a negative self-concept. If a child is told often enough that they're doing bad things, pretty soon they decide that they are bad, that they can't do things right, they always do things wrong. And once a child adopts that identity, it's very difficult to get rid of. Punishment is a strategy even when it works, even when it suppresses the behavior you do not want, leads to, in people, a loss of autonomy and self-regulation that in the long run does not serve you well. Now again, we don't really care about the autonomy or self-regulation of rats and pigeons. And so that's why it didn't matter then. That's why the behaviorists it was so easy for them to miss this particular difficulty. But for people, eventually people grow up and they have to learn to control themselves. And if they've always been controlled by exterior forces, especially punishment, they don't develop that self-control that they need. And you see this classically with freshmen who come to college, who maybe have had very strict parents who have controlled them. They've always had a strict curfew. They've always been watching. And they get to college and they go totally crazy. They go wild. You see them downtown because they don't know how to control themselves. Someone else has always been controlling them. And of course, in schools, one of the biggest problems with punishment is that you end up with a constant focus on behavior rather than learning. However, praise is not always great either. A problem with praise is that it can be a bit of a burden. If the teacher says, well, Susie's always the best kid. First of all, Susie's peers are going to hate her. If you say, well, why don't you look at Susie? She's doing it right. It won't take long for Susie to be a social isolate. And that punishment is much more powerful than the teacher's reward. But also, that's a pretty heavy burden to bear. And think about that the last time somebody said to you, oh, well, you're always so kind. Didn't you feel like you had to say, oh, no, I'm not really. I'm not that great. Okay, kids feel the same way. Also, praise is often very general and kind of meaningless. So your kid brings you a picture and you look at it and you say, oh, that's a really nice picture, honey, and you go on cooking dinner. And the kid keeps shoving the picture at you because you didn't say what they needed to hear. You didn't talk about the picture. So how do we make praise effective? Because it can be very effective. Actually, we have to learn how to praise people well, and it's very difficult because it's not instinctive. But basically, praise that is most effective describes the situation, the outcome, and perhaps your personal response rather than your judgment. And in doing so, it allows the person that you're praising to praise themselves rather than you. So instead of saying, you're always such a hard worker, which is kind of hard to take because, of course, nobody wants to be always a hard worker. A boss might say, I really appreciate the way you work to pull the team together. I know sometimes it's not easy. Instead of saying to a kid, you're so smart, you say something like, You came up with a great example yesterday. That was a real contribution to the discussion. Or when you're giving back a project, instead of saying, this was a very well organized project in a judgmental sort of a way, to say, your organization made it really easy for me to read and understand your project. Thanks. You get the drift. It's a difficult way originally to do things, but it works really, really well. Okay, so we had Pavlov, we had Skinner. The last big step in behaviorism actually begins to take us out of behaviorism, because you remember behaviorism is all about a behavior and a response. A stimulus, a behavior, and a response. And a consequence. Okay, well, Albert Bandura, whose picture is here, realized by watching people rather than rats and pigeons that people can learn when the consequences don't necessarily happen to them. They can watch consequences happening to other people and learn from that. And so this is kind of the beginning of recognizing that there is something in that black box, that we can watch a behavior and store it in our heads, in our minds, and then emit that behavior later. And he found this out by doing a series of experiments with a Bobo doll, one of those dolls you knock down. And it's really kind of funny to watch today because the adult model that he used is this woman, at least one of the adult models he used, is this woman standing there in heels and hose, beating the heck out of this Bobo doll. And if you go to the Bobo doll link that's in your module, you can watch this, and he'll explain this whole thing. One of the things that's important to know about modeling that your textbook does not talk about is that there are some conditions for modeling to be effective. For one thing, person has to be paying attention to the model. Modeling isn't any use if the person you want to have accepting the model is not paying any attention. Also, the person has to be able to retain the action. You cannot model an action for children, for example, that has multiple steps and expect them to repeat it because they can't retain all those steps and store them in their heads. The person also has to be able to produce the action being modeled. So, for example, if you are trying to teach a young child to do handwriting, they can watch you write those letters all that you want, but their hands may not be well enough controlled yet. They may not have enough fine motor control to do that letter, so the production can be a problem. And finally, only certain models are effective. Effective models are those which are considered to be rewarded or admired, and also similar or attainable. So modeling can be incredibly powerful for teachers. It's a wonderful strategy, but only if the teacher is a rewarded and admired person. So that's one reason to get along well with your students. And also if the teacher is not seen as so far away from the student that there's no point in even trying. If the student feels like the teacher knows everything and never makes a mistake, there's no point in trying to model after that teacher. But if the teacher shares the struggles they have sometimes, the mistakes they make, a little bit, not too much, of their personal life, then the student is more likely to say, oh, I could be like her, I could be like him, I want to do that. So again, enjoy watching the Bobo doll experiments. Finally, after you read your textbook, you're going to read something on behaviorism as used in video games. It's a great article. It goes over a lot of what's in the textbook, but with some really grounded examples. And then you're going to watch a video from Mr. Anderson. I forgot his first name. Anyway, he was one of the teachers of the year in his state, and he starts his video by saying, hello, I'm so-and-so Anderson, and my class is a video game. And so we're going to be talking about gamification, because this is one of the ways that behaviorism is having a huge resurgence in education. Your small group work will be about this video and the whole concept of gamification, as well as a little bit of review of some of these previous concepts. And so I think you'll enjoy the video, but I also want you to do some deep thinking about it. There are some pluses and some minuses to think about.